Hi friends, today I'm going to show you a method of machine embroidery called free motion embroidery. Now, embroidery machines can cost a pretty penny, but I bet you didn't know that your sewing machine is probably capable of doing embroidery by itself. Here is an example of embroidery I did in my last video. This is a pair of stays. So I'm going to show you how to do things like that. This is a free motion embroidery foot. Sometimes these can be found in that pile of sewing machine parts that you never use. My embroidery foot came with my machine, but you can always find them online if you need to buy one. Here are some other helpful materials you will need. Embroidery hoops, fabric, sewing pins, pencil, paper, colored thread, sewing scissors, and some type of interfacing. Now there are many different types of interfacing on the market, but the kind we're looking at specifically is tearaway interfacing. And while I was doing my research on where to buy tearaway interfacing, it looked like most of the reviews said that tearaway interfacing was basically just paper, and so I started experimenting using scratch paper as my interfacing, and I have yet to find a problem with it. It works really well, and it's a great way to reuse your old paper. Step 1. Design your embroidery. Try something simple your first time around. It should have larger shapes and fewer colors, and once you have the feel for that, you can move on to something more challenging. 2. Get your pattern onto your fabric. I recommend using a strong fabric like cotton because satins and organzas can be very tricky to embroider. It can be done, but try to stick with a sustainable natural fiber. If your fabric is sheer enough, then you can trace your design. Sometimes holding it up to a window helps, and if that doesn't work, you may have to freehand it or make some sort of stencil. Next, choose your colors. I like to stick with 3 colors for simplicity, so I don't have to change out the thread too much. You can use as many colors as you want, so just do whatever feels most comfortable to you. Cut out the interfacing. Make sure your paper is large enough to cover any area that is going to be filled in with thread. Place the paper on the back side and use pins to hold it in place. You want to keep your pins close to your drawing so that they don't get bent when you put it in the embroidery hoop, but you also don't want them to overlap the drawing so you don't accidentally sew your pins into your embroidery. Step 5. Select an embroidery hoop that will fit all or most of your design. Sometimes if it's too big, I'll have to do it in multiple sections at a time. I like to stick to the 3 smallest sizes for 2 reasons. The smaller hoops have more control over your fabric, keeping it nice and taut. And the second reason is if your hoop is too big, it will hit the side of the sewing machine and you won't be able to have as much mobility. 6. Unscrew the hoop and place your fabric inside. It's important that the screw is on the wrong side of the fabric because you want your fabric to be flat against the machine. Thread your machine. You can start with any color you want. The bobbin thread doesn't have to match. I always just keep it white. The bobbin thread won't be visible and it helps to not have to change out the bobbin thread constantly. Attach your embroidery foot and you're going to put the feed dogs down. The feed dogs are the teeth that keep the fabric going through the machine, but since we'll be moving our work around in multiple directions, we'll need them to go away. Mine switch off with this little knob on the side. Step 9. Place your work under the foot where you want to start sewing. Push the needle through and pick up the bobbin thread to keep it from tangling on the bottom. If the thread doesn't get picked up the first time, make sure that the thread is facing away from you and then try it again. Now there are 2 basic stitches you can do. You can do a straight stitch or a satin stitch. Straight stitches are good for filling in tiny details and can used to create really small details, like if you're embroidering someone's name on something. And then the satin stitch is good for filling in larger spaces. To do a satin stitch, you'll want to use a zigzag stitch and sew keeping them close together and going in the same direction. If you make sure to do them evenly without any gaps in between, your stitch will appear a little bit shiny and it looks really nice. When you embroider, your stitch length is determined by how fast you're moving your fabric around. If your thread keeps breaking or tangling, you probably will have to play around with the tension settings. The thread I like to use usually requires more tension than regular machine thread. Try not to embroider the same spot multiple times because it can break your needle. And once you get used to this technique, you'll usually know what sort of angles and speeds you need to create your design. Just kind of think of it as coloring inside a coloring book. If you need to switch colors, you can clip your top thread and rethread your machine with a new color. I don't usually cut the bobbin thread. I just make sure that it's not tangled by giving the hand wheel a little safety turn before starting again. I also sometimes skip over spots much like this. And when I'm done, I just cut those threads that are in between those spots. When you're finally finished with your design, release the foot, bring your work a few inches out and clip both threads. Now you're free to take it out of the frame and clip the extra threads. And now you can tear out that scratch paper. I find this part kind of satisfying because the needle has created all these little holes for your paper to kind of have this tear seam. If you can't get the paper out, you can try using tweezers or soaking it in water, but if you soak it in water, you want to make sure that you used a paper that doesn't have ink, because the ink will get wet and stain the fabric. Now you can give your work a good press and you're done. I always do my embroidery before I add the lining of whatever I'm making so that it will hide the back of the embroidery. Once again, this is just another fun sewing skill that takes a little bit of practice to get going, so don't feel discouraged if your first few attempts come out a little funny. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Please consider subscribing if you're not part of this wonderful community already. And if you have any questions about free motion embroidery or about the sewing or about me or whatever, you can comment them down below. And if you too already have some great tips on free motion embroidery, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. And I can't wait to see you guys in the next video.